Everybody can hear me? If you can't, just raise your hand and I will try to speak louder. Anyway, thank you all for having me. I have a long list of people who I owe something to, more or less. And some of you, many of you are actually on the list. And there are a whole bunch of other people, and you may recognize some of their names. But when you get to be 80 and you're a scientist and you keep publishing, you keep accumulating co-authors and people to whom you're greatly indebted. And everyone on this list has contributed ideas to me, but I'll take full credit for any errors. Anyway, there's a picture of me in 1945. That was back when I was very young, and you can see I was a promising botanist at that age, interested in longleaf pine, and still am. And so now when I'm 80, I look a little different, but nonetheless, the ideas and things are really interesting. And I got interested in the idea of old growth ecosystems a long time ago. I'll give Bruce Means great credit for working to get the Wade Tract with the Wades, and we have done wondrous things on the Wade Tract. We know an awful lot about longleaf pine ecosystems that we never knew before we got the Wade Tract to work on. And so I use this as my example of what we think of intuitively as a classic old growth ecosystem. So we're going to talk about these, and I'm going to introduce you first to some terminology. And this terminology is something that words or all of us will be aware of, but I'm using them in a specific way to talk about what I'm going to call old growth ecosystems. Old growth has been defined many ways. I prefer the definition of Paslevitz, which says old growth is intuitively understood, but not definable. And it's not definable because we have this plethora of ecosystems. And it's so hard to try to express the contributions from each ecosystem to the concepts. And so we're going to start by just showing you an old growth ecosystem. It doesn't look like any old growth ecosystem that's in the literature. It's completely different because most of the literature is about forest, specifically northern forest, and not the forest we have down here. And so this is Hillside Bog in Mississippi, and it has been burned. We started burning it when I went to LSU, and we produced this ecosystem as a result of the fires. In other words, we recovered it, if you will. And so each ecosystem has ecological units. The philosophers of science are very good at talking about ecological units. And we think of these classical units as populations, as communities, and as ecosystems. And so what we're concerned with here today are ecosystems as a specific unit that we want to deal with. So ecosystems have biotic components, they have abiotic components. We learned this in beginning ecology. And all ecosystems occur in a landscape context. And so the ecosystem is not an isolated unit, but it is something that occurs within the context of everything around it. So when you look at this bog and you say, yes, here's a population of pitcher plants, there obviously the aspect dominance in here. If you walk out into the bog, you discover there are a whole bunch of other species. There are plants, there are all sorts of animals in there. And so that becomes some sort of community or ecosystem, and it's in this context of everything around it. So all the abiotic conditions depend upon the flow of water, the amount of light that's coming in, and the absence of nutrients. And so the abiotic components are really defining this ecosystem. That ecosystem then has attributes. And the word attributes is something I'm going to use continuously. And it refers to three things. I'm going to use attributes to refer to the composition of an ecosystem. I'm going to use it to refer to the structure, the physical structure of the ecosystem, and I'm going to use it to refer to the dynamics. So if I want to really understand this pitcher plant bog, I have to not only understand what's there, but I have to understand how they're put together in the structure, and I have to understand the dynamics. And so when I go out there, I can characterize that pitcher plant at some point in time. And that's really crucial because what I have is a snapshot of what's actually there. And what's really important is if this is an old growth system, it has continuity back into the past. And that is a crucial aspect, and it is the one thing that is shared by all ecosystems that are old growth. They have that continuity into the past, and that continuity is of these attributes. So I can say the composition is there, it's been there, it may have changed, but the continuity is there. And that's what makes it old growth. This is a new idea, as it turns out. I hadn't really thought about it as new until I was at this workshop that the Forest Service ran to try and get all this set up. And it was amazing what people were trying to define as old growth in that context. And then there's another term that's really important, and that's integrity. We think of this as naturalness. Every time I talk to people and they say, I know what's old growth when I'm out in it. It's natural. It feels like everything belongs there. It's sort of functioning the way it should. And so that is old growth. And what they are really describing is integrity. And what we can say is all ecosystems have integrity, but not all of them have the high integrity that represents the maintenance of this continuity throughout the past. And so we'll be talking about these things. And so these are the terms we are going to be using as I talk. So our time period that we have to deal with ecology is about 125 years now. In 1900, Cowles, studying Lake Michigan and the dunes on Lake Michigan, said the province of ecology is to consider the mutual relations between plants and the environment. You'll notice when you deal with ecology as a science that almost everything with respect to ecology, okay, deals with plants. Press escape to show floating meeting control. Okay. And so anyway, Cal started it out by thinking of the relationship between the plants and the environment as the province of ecology. Clements comes along not too long later and talks about succession and the process of development and formation of plant communities. And he stimulated a tempest in a teapot. And Gleason came along and said, it's not the organizing of this whole community, it's just the sum of the individuals in the community, and each of them is responding independently. Cooper then came along in 1926 and said, what's really important is change. The fundamental basic fact in vegetation study is still that it's always changing. And we sort of recognize this, but when we take our snapshot in a community, we don't always see that change. And so it tends to get de-emphasized relative to other aspects of the ecology. Tansley then came along in 1935, and he's the one who's given credit about talking about ecosystems. And he said, the organism may claim our interest. We're interested in plant communities or animal communities, excuse me, but we can't separate them from the physical environment. That's actually what Cowles said too. And so he decided that what we call this is an ecosystem. And the ecosystem, as Tansley defined it, is a unit a basic unit of nature, he called it, because what it's doing is it's unifying the biota and the abiotic environment into one unit, and they kind of interact and they evolve. And so the organisms become adapted to that particular environment. So one ecosystem on a given set of physical conditions is different than the ecosystem on another set of physical conditions. That was a major advance in terms of the thinking, because it began to say all of these things are interacting, they're all forming units, and they're all changing. Then Whittaker comes along and introduces a new term. And his term is a steady state. And he said, what is really going on is these are always changing, but they kind of move to where they're in kind of a steady state, and they kind of stay there for a long period of time. This is the forerunner then of old growth in its original concept and that idea. And that development of the idea of these communities as being in a steady state, representing some old growth condition, is something that went along for a long period of time. I use a summary of Neil Peterson in 2017, in which he said what people really did. They said forests were considered to be in a dynamic equilibrium. Our old growth forests are in a dynamic equilibrium, or a shifting mosaic steady state. All this terminology that ecologists use, fancy words, if you will. But at any point, what they're saying is that this is a kind of a dynamic thing that's changing. They're reconciling that, but it's changing in ways that maintains a constant picture over time. Okay. Now at this point, nobody's fallen asleep yet, but as a professor, I know what happens when you start talking about terminology and trying to get people to understand where you're coming from. It can be very boring. I'm speaking right into this thing. It's not very loud, and I guess the acoustics aren't so great in here, but I'll try. I'm yelling, I think, in my voice. So I'm going to say, let's take 1975 and 2025. In 1975, I had just gotten my PhD. I had learned all the stuff about ecology, and I thought I knew what old growth was. Here it is 2025, 50 years later. And I don't really think I understand it all very well, but I'm still trying to learn. As you get older, you learn that you know less and less about more and more. And it's really good. Whoops. Now that was not supposed to do that. Okay. So we have two contrasting models now. We have a model from 1975, which lasts up until the 2000s, in which forest in a dynamic equilibrium with old trees. They're museums of some pre-settlement condition. We as humans have destroyed most of it. But wherever it's left with minimal human interference, we think of that as sort of old growth. It conserves those historic conditions that gave rise to that particular community. And so they really are considered as museums. And they're based on succession models where you have a climax condition or a steady state or quasi-equilibrium, whatever words you want to use. And after it's disturbed, it tends to return to that. And so that's the basic kind of concept. Now let's move forward to 2025. And after the workshop and working with all the people I've been working with in this study, we find something very different. We now think this is not at all steady state. It is completely a non-equilibrium system. It has integrated biotic and abiotic aspects. That's what makes it an ecosystem. They're integrated, and all those components of that ecosystem are changing, and they're not changing in the same way where they head toward a climax. The position may be headed one way, the structure may be headed a slightly different way. The dynamics are floating all over the place. And so what we're saying is these ecosystems have been through a period of change. They have been changing over time for a very long time. And those changes are influencing the ecosystem, and they probably make it better able to handle future changes because they have this history that's locked up in the ecosystem. And that's a really important concept because what it says is these ecosystems are really important for guiding restoration and management into the future because they have been through all these things that have gone on. And so they have inherently locked up in them that genetic material that will enable them to respond to future changes. So we have temporal continuity models. The ecosystem has been and is responding and will respond to these environmental changes. When we come in as people and we disrupt all this stuff, we destroy all that continuity and we remove a lot of these aspects that may be important. So we can take a model. Here's Woodyard hammock, big old trees. This is a model for 1975, where you would say this is the climax ecosystem with beech and magnolia and things like that. Today, I look at that and I say, that's not the best model. This is a model where you have hurricanes coming through periodically. You have all sorts of things going on that are creating dynamics. And so it's not a steady state system. It's always changing. Each hurricane is different. It does different things. And so the forest is always bouncing around in some sort of space, if you will, that way. So concepts now that I'm suggesting are much more dynamic and much, much more difficult to express. So I can contrast the models here. This is the succession model. Okay. Try that again. Hey, it's much louder. Thank you. My voice, I'm getting dried out because I was trying to yell so loud. So maybe this will be better. And there will be an echo, so I'll try not to make it echo. So in 1990, the US Forest Service published a huge compendium on old-growth forest in the Pacific Northwest. The definition, old-growth forests are ecosystems distinguished by old trees and related structural features. They encompass later stages of stand development that typically differ from earlier stages in several ways, and they went on to list all those things. And so what they had is a model of succession. So you start out on some sub-climax stage, you have no disturbance, the community organizes, it develops, and becomes a climax. That climax then stays that way it is, or something like that, subject to all the changes that are sort of minor changes that go on. If you have a big disturbance, then you send it back to the earlier stages and it comes back. We all learned this theory in beginning ecology. So that's the old growth, is this climax state at the very end. But there are a bunch of people working on fire, and they said, nah, that's not quite the way it works in ponderosa pine forests. You have this frequent disturbance, so it is somehow operating to keep these stages at a subclimax, and we want to call this a fire climax. So they call that the fire climax. And so everybody got together and they said, you can have a system that stays in the climax state, or you can have a periodic, regular environmental disturbance. It's part of the natural environment, and that sends it back, and it goes back to the climax state, and its return, it goes back and forth. So the model gets more complex, but it's still a very simple model. I'm going to contrast that now with what we think of as a much more current model. We owe an enormous amount to paleoecologists for this, because they have been able to go back into time and look at ecosystems far beyond where people were doing when they take these snapshots of extant forests and try to extrapolate back in time. So our model looks like this, roughly, and I show it to you because it's a mess. And then what people are now saying is that, yes, the way we view the changes in forest is something of a mess. So we have a 3D trajectory here. This is a 3D model, and you start up here at the top. That's back in the way in the history of the forest, and it comes forward, and this bright line comes up to the T, and then goes over to 2 and 3 and down to 4. In this model, the lines represent the trajectory of change in the forest, and the circles represent disturbances that somehow alter whatever trajectory is going on. And so you can start back here, very ancient forest, and come forward. Here's a disturbance, it gets moved, and so forth. And so we can look at this in terms of its history. The time period between 1 and T is this paleoecological history. And that is a time period where we can trace it. You can look at the forest, you get the record from paleoecology, and it goes back, and you can see all these things that happen as much as you have. Further you go back, the less resolution you have. So it gets more hazy. But the idea is it did those things, and it got to the point T. T then is a current state with time T, and it has a big disturbance. And that disturbance, you'll see that the color was blue. You could say the dominant species maybe was blue. And all of a sudden, it's no longer the dominant species. Yellow takes over, and you move over to T. Green takes over for a while. Yellow comes back, another disturbance. And it starts moving. Go to 3 is another disturbance. And on up down to 4, which we are at the current time, with a current disturbance. So the trajectory passes through disturbances and pathways, and each of these has possible outcomes. And the colors in these circles represent potentially different outcomes. So depending upon the nature of the disturbance and what it does, you might be yellow, but you might be green. And so these paler things here in the background are possible trajectories that were never realized. Maybe in a different ecosystem, that trajectory might be realized, but in this particular ecosystem, it's gone through this way. So this model, give all credit to Neil Peterson for this, is that the forest is never in equilibrium. It has periods of rapid change and slow change, and apparent steady states that might sit around for a while, but it nonetheless is always changing. So the trajectory is this ever-changing smooth path with multiple configurations and multiple possibilities, so that there is no well-defined outcome like we would predict from succession. Only following a certain disturbance can you then have some predictability as to where you will be until the next disturbance. So what is important here is that this line represents temporal continuity. The forest has attributes, the species, the structure, the dynamics, and those are all maintained all the way from 1 to 4. But they're changing. And so it's what it is that makes a system old growth then is that this temporal continuity has been maintained. It has been maintained, but changing all the way through. So that species that are at 1 might be species here at 4. They may have evolved, they may have changed in aspects and characteristics, but they could well be there at the very end. So this is a different kind of model. And so I've given you a couple models so we can talk about these then. And so the important thing here is that old growth ecosystems have attributes. The species composition, if you're a bacterium, it would be sequences, genetic sequences of exact sequence variants or something like that. If you're animals, it would be population and so forth. They all have structure. The structure is primarily due to the vegetation and the associated detritivores and things like bacteria and microbes. And the animals sort of roam around inside this structure, but sometimes the animals are important as part of the structure. And they all have dynamics. These dynamics involve how the populations interact, how the populations interact with natural environmental conditions, and of course, how those environmental conditions are changing could be important. And of course, things like natural disturbances, hurricanes, fires, volcanoes, and so forth. So they all have these attributes. All ecosystems have attributes, but they're not the same from one ecosystem to another. Two, if you're an old growth system, you have continuity of those attributes. And what we're saying is that period goes back sometime into the evolutionary past. And all ecosystems then can be thought, old growth systems can be thought of as high integrity in terms of our human effects on them. And so we come along as humans and we may not clear cut a forest, we may just hydrate it. It's lowering the integrity, but it doesn't remove it completely. To get to zero integrity, you have to put up a parking lot or plow a field or do something that destroys the ecosystem that was there. And so it's possible then to look at ecosystems that are not old growth and say, how do we make them more old growthy? As long as we have the models from these systems with intact continuity, we should be able to do that. So let's think a little bit now about these old growth attributes. And so I show you a picture from Kisatchie National Forest with rock outcrops. And we could say this rock outcrop is a local ecosystem within the surrounding pine savanna. And so the conditions, the physical environment in there is different than the physical conditions in the pine savanna itself. And so we have local differences in ecosystems, this landscape that we're talking about. And so ecosystem composition takes the form of taxon richness, life form richness, if we want to think of it that way. And there's a crucial element here that begins to come into it, and that's endemism. If we have an organism that has evolved inside this ecosystem and has become adapted for these particular ecosystem conditions, it's giving us a signal. And that signal is the ecosystem, however it has changed, it has been possible for this species to evolve and maintain itself all the way through to the current time. So we're thinking about ecosystem now, thinking about endemism now, as an aspect of a population or a species, some sort of taxon that says it occurs here and nowhere else. That's what makes it endemic. The ecosystem has a structure. You think of the structure of this rock outcrop, the vegetation, where you've got these shrubs in here around the rocks. It's different than the surrounding area with pine trees and things. And so there's this physiognomy is really important in terms of the system. So it is a second attribute of the ecosystem. And then we have natural ecosystem dynamics. The processes, energy flow, nutrient cycling, all the coevolution and coadaptation of species falls into these dynamic relationships in the ecosystem. And so those two should have continuity if they're going to be part of the old growth ecosystem. And so these ecosystems, the biota, the physical environment, are embedded within the landscape. And we all know that that landscape is going to interact with each ecosystem. Animals are going to move across it. Plants are going to disperse their seeds from one into the other, so forth and so on. So you have to understand aspects of how the landscape is interacting with the ecosystem. So all ecosystems have these attributes. Here's a salt marsh, coastal marsh. It has attributes. It has composition, it has structure, it has dynamics. So all ecosystems have these, but they're different from one ecosystem to the other. So when we define old growth for a given ecosystem, if I want to define old growth for a marsh, I can do that, but it won't be the same as the conditions that are used to define a forest. And so the characteristics then differ, and you just have to go out and study them and find them. And so the dynamics are going to vary as well. I mean, there in this marsh, there will be salt from tidal inflows. There are tidal influences. There's no tidal influence on that rock outcrop in the Kisatchie National Forest. And so the dynamics and everything are all different among these. We know this, but they are all united in that they have these attributes. Whoops. Now that was not supposed to happen. Okay. Continuity then. Here's a salt marsh in Cocodrie, Louisiana, along the coast here. And the composition of this marsh, it's an old growth marsh, has continuity. The structure has continuity, and the dynamics all have continuity. They may be influenced in various ways by the environment, and one place is different than another, but this continuity is really critical if we're going to think about old growth ecosystems. We know that a forest in the Pacific Northwest that's called old growth today is not the same forest that it was in 1700 or 1600 or 1500. It is not the same. The environment is not the same, let alone the fact that people are changing the environments massively these days. And so we don't think of this as maintaining the same conditions, but rather maintaining this continuity. In the case of this marsh, we can actually go in and get some estimates of age from the sediments in the marsh. I mean, there have been sediments in marshes go back thousands of years with the sediments lined up and stratified, and you can age those sediments the same way you could age trees by getting rings on them and so forth. And so the idea here is that it's possible to understand the continuity more if you know certain things about the ecosystem. And pores in a marsh are not going to be applicable to rock outcrops in the Kisatchie, for example, but they nonetheless are ways that we have of getting at the continuity. So what we're saying is that the continuity of attributes is not interrupted in old growth. And so old growth can be changing, but as long as that continuity is maintained, it is an old growth ecosystem. It can shift in location over space, even if you think about it. Think about these dunes on the Florida coast here. And the dunes are constantly changing. They're moving around. The ecosystem that's on there with the dune grasses like the sea oats and the other kinds of species are actually moving in location. But they're being maintained over time. The populations are being maintained. It's just that the seeds or the rhizome are being moved in location, so they're in a slightly different position. So you maintain community. So that means that continuity is not necessarily site-based. We tend to think of it as site-based. We want to go back till that site was something else. What we really should be thinking about old growth is this is an ecosystem that we can trace back in time, and we may have to go someplace else to get to its real origin. I can use longleaf pine savannas and ecosystems in the Southeast as a good example. Go back maybe 10,000 years at most, and they disappear. But when they appear in the fossil record, they are well developed, which means they have to have a history someplace else. And so we can say, yes, it's there. It's just that place where it originated is no longer there. And so we can think about these things then in terms of how they are not site-based, but ecosystem-based. And continuity has all sorts of influences on it. If we think about prairies in the Midwest that the Indians were burning for 10,000 years, or in Australia where you have Aboriginals measuring and managing the land for 50,000 years. That is now part of the record of those communities. And so There are potential cultural influences. Humans are part of the world the same as the rest of nature, and we shouldn't try to define old growth as being no human influence whatsoever. We have to say it can influence and does. But what we don't want to do is say, well, just because humans came along and cut all the trees down and the trees regrew, it's an old growth system. That doesn't work. So this temporal continuity then is the foundational concept of old growth ecosystems as they can be considered at the current time. So let's now talk about integrity. Ecosystems have high integrity, and that integrity means old growth ecosystems with high integrity means that that continuity in the attributes has been maintained. Continuity in composition. We may have species that don't appear, don't even know they're there, and disturbance comes along, like a hurricane in a marsh, and all of a sudden here come species that were either seeds or bulbs or whatever, however they were living and stored, they're there. They were there, and so there is continuity in composition. Continuity in structure. Here we have two different forests, each of which has similar sort of structure, but with important differences. You got a beech magnolia forest on the left, and sort of this classic old growth system. And over here we have sandpine scrub. And sandpine scrub can be just as old growth and have the same continuity as the beech magnolia forest. The continuity in dynamics, where the processes are working, they're staying. And so the dynamic processes in our systems are often fire, and fire is a major influence. And so you're gonna have a fire coming through, the ecosystem is changed. You have continuity in composition, you have continuity in structure. It may change, but it's continuity. And then you have continuity in the dynamics with recurrent fires that come through periodically and affect the ecosystem. So old growth ecosystems then have attributes with high integrity, and that old growth integrity of attributes is not interrupted. It has that continuity. Integrity is maintained over time, but the ecosystems may shift in location. So the integrity fits with the continuity and is maintained even if the location is changing. And again, cultural and ecological influences modify integrity the same way that they affect continuity. So we then say that the real value of this approach to dealing with old growth ecosystems is that you can use these systems to manage, to increase the integrity of the attributes. We actually have some goals for restoration and management that we can work with and try to work with here. I show you a system in Abita Springs, which is a low elevation pine savanna. And on the left is a system before fire was put in, the immediate effect, and the effect 6 months later. So what this fire has done is change these attributes. They've changed them, but the continuity is maintained. And so you can work with this continuity to try and get better, more growth-like aspects of the attributes. So you manage the attributes, you maintain the integrity. And that's all you need to do to get restoration and management. In this case, the ground fires change structure, to a lesser extent, composition, and it maintains the continuity of both over time. Now, contrast that with coming in and using mechanical treatment to disrupt the soil to try and get rid of shrubs and things in the understory. That does something very different. It's disrupting the continuity of a whole bunch of attributes when you do that. you can actually really manage if you take these things and you work with them and you do it. This shows Weeks Bay, where over a period of now roughly 20 years, the same forest that was the marsh was invaded by shrubs. And after 20 years of fires, you see a few shrubs left that are sort of dead here, killed back to the ground. And you have all sorts of species that have increased in abundance that are a result of having lots of fires in a more open kind of system. And so these kinds of ways are important for dealing with integrity and how to work with integrity to guide restoration and management. This means that our old systems can become really useful. They're no longer museums that sort of reflect something of the past, but they are guides for where we want to go when we are managing for the future. So, old growth ecosystems, then, if I sort of summarize this, then we have the attributes, the composition, structure, and function. We have temporal continuity of these attributes, and we maintain the continuity of these attributes. We have high integrity for the ecosystem. And we're expecting these ecosystems in that we have managed so as to maintain the continuity to be able to respond more readily to future changes in the environment than we would expect if they did not have that continuity. So I want to explore just a little bit of this with our region of the world. We deal with the North American coastal plain. And this is a global biodiversity hotspot. So we're dealing with a really species-rich region of the world where almost 30% of the species are endemic in this whole region. So it fits with 36 other hotspots in the world that are known as containing high endemism and high biodiversity. Now, within this thing, the Eastern Gulf Coastal region has really high biodiversity and endemism. When Alan Week was here, he talked about this. But of the plant families, there are 170 plant families in our region of the world, in the Big Bend region here. More than 170 plant families here. You'll notice no other section of the country comes close in terms of plant families. So there's a lot of what Alan calls deep endemism, this sort of high level endemism associated with this region of the world. In genera, more than 600 genera. So we are also really rich in this region of the world. And plant species, there are more than 1,400 plant species. This is in areas of 2,500 square kilometers. I use for comparison the Apalachicola National Forest, which is roughly 2,300 square kilometers, sorry. And then we even have narrow endemics, things like Harpericollis and McBridie and stuff. There are more than 25 species in our little neck of the woods right here that are endemic to only this region of the world. The only other section that is like this is in California, where you have species on mountaintops that are endemic to particular mountaintops. They've been separated and they've speciated like that. So here we have a flat piece of land that has as many endemics as California has with all these mountains. And so it's really interesting in trying to figure out what it is that's produced this endemism. Of the endemic plant species, 85% occur in our NACP, the National Coastal Plain Hotspot, occur in pine savannas and their embedded habitats. So overwhelmingly, a single major ecosystem type and all its associated varieties contains most of the endemism and a huge chunk of the biodiversity in the system. Of course, pine savannas run from eastern Texas up to very southern tip of Virginia. And so it's quite a large area, and they go all the way down to subtropical Florida, which is filled with its own set of species, but it is part of this biodiversity hotspot. All of these habitats that are associated with longleaf pine have a long evolutionary association with very frequent, what we think of as low intensity fires, as opposed to hot crown fires, ones that are more intense. These species that are endemic to pine savannas include two major groups of species. There are abundant and widespread endemic species. About 35% of the endemic species in these communities are widespread. They are older groups. We can think of some very classic examples of longleaf pine itself, a salt palmetto, a wiregrass. There are a whole bunch of these species that are quite widespread and yet are endemic to the area. These species turn out to be ones that have somehow interacted with fire in their evolutionary history because they produce pyrogenic fuels and they reflect some sort of multi-million year coevolution with fire, probably since the late Miocene. We don't have a good handle on exactly how. But this arson geel, if you think of it that way, is interacting with the disturbance, and that's affecting the environment, and that's affecting all the other species that are in this ecosystem. So somewhere along the line, this whole ecosystem is going on its own little path, if you will, as a result of that. And so the environment is conducive then for the evolution of other species that are specialized on the conditions that result after fire. And I would say classic examples of this are soil conditions or edaphic conditions, nutrient conditions. Pitcher plant bogs that are embedded in these pine savannas are one classic example of this. These local inclusions then add to the endemism, and they often are more recently evolved. So it's like the whole evolution of this system, if we think about it, what we're doing is saying we have in our pine savannas a whole bunch of things that are really old growth pine savannas or near old growth pine savannas, if you want to say it. They just don't happen to have big trees, but they have a more or less intact ground layer, and that ground layer is really crucial then because it's what burns. And so it's really important to start thinking about these systems as not just having old trees, but having a whole bunch of other species that have this long continuity in association with fire in this case. The life history traits of these species sort of fall into this. We can use longleaf pine or savanna pines in general as ecosystem engineers, because what they do is they wind up modifying the whole ecosystem. One of the aspects of frequent fires, you have to be resistant to the fire. You have to have a way to survive the fire. And in the case of pines, you have multiple life cycle stages that survive the fires. So small plants, big plants, trees, tall trees, they all survive the fires. They are protected above ground meristems and protected bark in the case of the big trees. And what that does is it means that the effect of fire on survival of pines is very low. Fire doesn't affect it. They have high survival. Furthermore, these species are adapted for this frequent fire regime. They have undergone evolution so that they're capable of responding post-fire. So we have things like rapid germination after dispersal. Longleaf pine disperses its seeds in the fall, and they germinate within weeks. They undergo rapid development, and so by the end of the 6 months before the next fires, typically, they have produced primary needles and secondary needles and are more apt to survive the fires. The precocial development is an adaptation for being in very frequent fire regimes. The indeterminate flushing of needles, if they get burned and the needles get killed, they just put out new ones. If you go out west and you look at ponderosa pine and you put a fire in May, you kill every young little tree that you defoliate because they don't reflush until the next spring. But our pines do that right away. You can burn them and they'll come back within no period of time. We all sort of know that. Whoops. Where am I here? And so that's the thing. And then we have this modification of fire regime by the effects on the fuels. The regrowth of seaport grasses, they regrow really fast in a warm environment and wind up producing lots of fuels. In the case of pine needles, the needles elevate fire temperatures when they're shed and dried. And so they are affecting the characteristics of the fires directly. You can see this. If you ever you burn someplace with pine needles and you get a much harder fire, more intense fire than you get if you burn an area that doesn't have pine needles. We all know this. And we use this very effectively in management. But what we get are these positive feedback loops then, that what in natural systems is happening is that these species that are the pyrogenic arson group here, they're actively promoting fire. And so we have this long, if we break that, about clear cutting all the big trees, then what do? You lose all the pine needles. And so those kinds of things are interrupting the continuity of a very important trait. And so we need to consider that when we're dealing with these management of these systems. The critical ecosystem functions in the pine savanna's current ground level. On the wade tract, most of the biodiversity resides at the ground level. I mean, the wade tract has roughly 525 native plant species, and 45% of those are endemic species. That's almost half the flora is endemic to the coastal plain and is not occurring in other kinds of ecosystem or in other places in the world. And so that's got high endemism. If we look at the fungi, they're roughly on the wade tract 12,000 exact sequence variants, we call them. That's when you do the gene mapping and then you say, these are the different sequences. And about 50% of those have been only recorded in savannas. Again, then lots of endemics and bacteria. There's some 60,000 ESVs that we have recorded. And from 22 phyla, huge variation in types of bacteria. And about 50% of those are endemic to savannas. So we're dealing with a system which has evolved in relation to fire and has evolved all of these endemic species. And we know from the studies that we've done on the wade tract, the diversity of fungi and bacteria is strongly related to fire. Fire changes the community, and then the community responds, and it changes. And in the case of the bacteria and fungi, they're so rapid, they have such short life cycle, if you think of it that way, that they can respond right away. And so you get all these things, you're not even sure, but you may be getting new evolutionary combinations as a result in a single site that way. And bacteria and fungi produce feedbacks. They deter decomposition of the fine fuels, so they build up the fine fuels faster, promoting fires more quickly. So you want if you're trying to manage for a pine savanna, you want a good ground layer with all of these species. And if you're managing and restoring, it would be really good probably to get inoculants of the ground layer bacteria and fungi and put them in your ecosystem as you burn it so that you can build up this kind of ecosystem as part of that. Interesting, we don't tend to think of working with the bacteria and fungi as being an essential part of restoration, but it almost certainly is really crucial. We know a lot about fire regimes, and this is the work that Gene has done with the fire return intervals for Tyndall Flatwoods here. You see an old tree with lots of fire scars. This is a stump. And we know from the study that she has helped produce here that they have 30 stumps, 25 that were used to build the fire record. The first fire scar that she has is 1516, the last 1819, 300 years. All right, during the period of time, you think of 1516, that's right after Ponce de Leon landed on the East Coast, all right? All the way up to 1819, so pretty Civil War period of time. Total number of fire scars is 621. The number of fire years is 245. If you say we need at least 10 trees to get a good return interval for fires in this period of time, it turns out that that period of time is 1.1 years. So fires are essentially occurring every year in this particular pine savanna. And Gene has done studies and is working on this with Kevin and Monica Rother. And we know now that there are other sites that they're looking at that have very high fire frequencies exactly like this. So the fire becomes this sort of essential, critical part of the environment. It's occurring every year. It's sort of like another environmental condition, except it's not just any other. It's the most important one in terms of what's going on with the dynamics. We know something about the season because it can age, and the scars, each fire scar, we can say where it is within the annual ring. And you'll see that 86% occur in the lightning season. More than half the fires occur during a very small period of time in the transition from the dry springs to the wet summers with the onset of lightning strikes. What we're defining here is something about the environment that we know for old growth systems is likely that we need to try and imitate. Fires as often as you can burn them, and fires at this critical time, it's in the growing season, not in the winter time, not when it's easy to burn, but at a time when much of the vegetation is already out and doing its thing. And what you're doing then is clipping those off. You're taking the tops of the vegetation off. I think of them as having disposable parts. So it burns through. They just resprout. Or if they have seeds, you might have seedlings coming on at that time. But there's a very definite aspect of the community then, which is saying that the fires are linked into these ecosystems, and an old growth pine savanna needs to have fires that are going to mimic what's going on under natural conditions. We need a lot more samples to decide, is Tyndall aberrant? It's right next to the coast. Maybe it gets more lightning strikes because it's right next to the coast and thunderstorm coming off the Gulf of America, I think is supposed to be now. And then start the fires and do their thing. But some of the other sites are more interior and also showing these very same high patterns. So we have a vegetation fire feedback model that is really important. And that says that the plants and the microbes are influencing the fire regimes in the context of the fuels, the local conditions. So whatever determines plant growth and the production of fuels is really important. And so we can say in our pine savanna, we have one pine grassland, I call them, one pine savanna, one pine woodland. Maybe this is up and down on a moisture gradient or something like this. Each of those is undergoing its own control. And so we think of this over time, what we're saying is these don't move from one into the other particularly. You can have species that might move, might happen occasionally. By and large, they tend to be somewhat different. And so they are undergoing their own change over time. They don't undergo succession, though. They don't undergo any kind, they're changing but not in a way that's related to the patterns that have been described for old growth forests. But if you change them and you lose that fire-based evolutionary continuity, you go someplace else. And so now you're off into some mixed pine hardwood forest or some other de novo system. And if you put fire back in, it doesn't go back to where it was before. It goes off into something different. And so it's really crucial when we're trying to do management and restoration that we think of it how we're actually manipulating and what we're manipulating and how we're doing it. But it's not easy to go from the right to the left. It's very easy to go from left to right. All you have to do is put humans in the system and just muck it up. Right? But how do you put it back? That's a challenge. I'm 80. I'm not going to solve that. Maybe somebody out there, most of you are not that young either, but there are young people back in there. Most of them in the very back of the room. So that's your challenge. I think of this as old growth and neo growth. So what we have as old growth is everything that has retained that continuity, particularly in the ground layer and in the soil layers, the litter layers, and so forth. And then we have this other stuff over here, and how we get from here back is a good question. It may take a lot of seeding of integral parts and start doing things like that. Very labor intensive and costly. The savanna physiognomy is part of this too. In our old growth stands, we have uneven aged and sized pines. And we have this ground layer dominated by C4 grasses. And so anytime you burn them, they flower. They're all adapted for flowering after fire kind of thing. And then there's this small scale biodiversity. And so down underneath these grasses is all this biodiversity lurking out at ground level. And we don't understand anything about it. Nobody has come in and tried to characterize the structure of a pine savanna ground layer in the way it needs to be described in order to try and look at it. And to ask the question of, has that structure had continuity? And so that's a good question. We have measured the biodiversity. We know that the larger the area, the more the species. And so like in an area the size of half this room, there's easily 100 species in my pine savannas. And so there's a lot of species, a lot to deal with in these ecosystems that way. So we have lots of old growth characteristics, and I'm not going to, oh, it's telling me, is it telling you? Oh, in case you can't hear me, you can read. And I don't know how to get rid of it. This is something different, okay? And you'll learn something new every day. Somewhere there's a button I push, and it's doing that. So since I don't know how to get rid of it, we'll just go on with it. So anyway, I don't want to belabor all of these characteristics. The plant species and the ground layer are really basic to the composition. They're fire-related conservative characteristics of these ground layers. These ground layer plants and these pine savannas are not rapidly increasing species. You look at populations of these species, and some of these species can colonize roadsides, and they do it, but do they make solid stands along roadsides? Not usually. Thank you. Josh is good at this. So we have those. We have fire-related fungi and bacteria that are involved in nutrient cycling and decomposition, and they are important too. And the trees are important too, but they are not nearly as important as the rest of the ecosystem for this. And we can keep going. It's a physiognomy. We have this physiognomy. We know it involves the trees and the ground layer, but we don't know much about the ground layer and its physiognomy at all. And we know a lot about the short-term dynamics from fire studies and what goes on, but they're not fire studies conducted under the same kind of conditions that characterize old growth, this continuity with respect to the actual fire regime itself that we see from tree ring records. And then we have this long-term dynamics. We don't know anything about this. We have no history really for the longleaf pine ecosystem. We can't go back and even get cores from most places. We can't go back beyond 500 years or so for trees and things like that. And so we have something that we really need to be able to look for ways that we might be able to do some of these things. So we have this hotspot with pine savannas being the crucial thing, and we need to understand how we're going to deal with it. We want to maintain the biodiversity hotspot. We have to maintain pine savannas. If we want to maintain pine savannas, we have to know something about what is an old growth system and how it works. This long-term coevolutionary relationship with fire is crucial. The physiognomy, the endemic plant species, and all this high biodiversity is all tied up with this old growth aspect of these systems. And these fires, they're almost annual, are reproducing this current selection. You think about it, I have apologies for Joni Mitchell here, what I call the circle game. You have fire comes through and it does things to the vegetation. The vegetation responds, here comes the next fire, does it again. And so the whole ecosystem is constantly evolving in this context of a very frequent fire. And we don't understand much about this really at all. And so we have this system, it's non-successional. We don't understand its real dynamics, and we certainly don't understand its real dynamics in the context of old growth ecosystems, which is what we really need to do if we're going to restore and manage longleaf pine ecosystems. So I think of it roughly as a two-stage process. We have this initial old group of species, these widespread species that are ancient species, and they seem to have set it up. Then we have all this stuff that follows, which is this biodiversity and proliferation of endemic species. And that is certainly a consequence of something to do with how this fire regime is set up. So, formerly, this was almost 2%, 3% of North America. So now we have all these remnants left. I just listed a few of them, and everybody could go into wherever your favorite area is and come up with others. There are many large federal land holdings. They're managed by different agencies. They all have their own idiosyncratic history of land use and management. And it's just legendary how much different they are with respect to all these. They lack shared ecological guidelines for conservation and ecological function. And we'll have some old growth tracts. What we're thinking of as an old growth system, as one with this continuity of attributes, says that what we have is really a lot of old growth. It's fragmented, it's distributed in strange ways, but we really need to be focusing on these systems, not on the basis of trees, but on the basis of the entire ecosystem and the continuity of those attributes in those ecosystems. So here's the Apalachicola National Forest. What have they done? I mean, this is a recent paper, relatively speaking, with historic natural communities, historic relative to not very long ago, but nonetheless, it would be possible to work with an area like this and deal with this and try and identify those areas that really do have this continuity of attributes over time. It's definitely possible and should be done if we want to conserve this into the future. So I look on it this way. I'm 80 years old, and in my lifetime, We have better defined the historical aspects of longleaf pine savannas. We know a lot more about their evolutionary history and their recent history than we knew when I first started. When I came down and was at Tall Timbers in 1978, people always said longleaf pine is the first stage of succession. It's only got one tree, and the climax is beech magnolia forest. And I, after walking out on the wade track with Bruce the first time, I said, oh man, the biodiversity has nothing to do with trees. It's just everywhere. And when you go out to an old growth site like this, you will see is you can't go 10 feet without finding a new species because it's that diverse. And we have done conservation in my lifetime. We have been able to identify sites. Nature Conservancy has done a great job at starting out and doing a lot of conservation, and a lot of that has been done. And so we have sites that have continuity of attributes. That has happened in my lifespan. We've gone, when I grew up, my father was a county agent, and he was in charge, an extension agent of all of Northwest Florida. And I used to ride with him in the car, and there were pine savannas everywhere. People burned it all the time, and there were trees everywhere and ground cover. And you go out and I'd say, God, there's something really weird flowering out there. And go out and look at it. It might be a pine lily or something like that. Come back a few weeks later, can't find one, but there'd be something else flowering. And there are all these rattlesnakes and things like that that were running around at that time. We've lost most of that, but we have conserved enough that we can maintain the ecosystem. We want to maintain a fire-frequented habitat in the southeastern US and North America. Really, this is the place to do it, and this is where we need to be. And so what we have to do is say, these attributes and the continuity, they've fed back and forth, and we've done quite a bit here. We can do more, but we've done quite a bit. Where we have done really poorly is in trying to figure out which sites have the best integrity and which ones we need, how we manage to bring other sites so they have more old growth attributes and more can restore some of that continuity and make them into sites that would be good for the future. That's a challenge for the next generation. It's not my challenge. And on that point, I'll end and entertain any questions. Thank you for being patient and listening. Overwhelming, isn't it? Yeah. I think it was off the coast. It could have been in Mexico and along the Gulf Coast further south. Uh, that was a weather was drier then. Remember in the Pleistocene, it was not only cool, it was also drier. And so there are areas back there. And it could have come in that way. People have looked at the genetics of longleaf pine, and there's been some suggestion, I'm not quite sure how good the data are, that it came from the Southwest. We certainly know that a lot of species like scrub jays and Aristida, all of these came out of the Southwest. And if you look at the closest relatives of species that are in our pine savannas, over half of them come from south. Not very many come down from the north. We are not picking up boreal influences that came down and then wound up somehow speciating here very much. We don't have a lot of that. Our boreal species are ones that are among the most rare and endangered species. You know, you think about what's it, Apalachicola bluffs and things like that. So they were here. We don't even know what they would have looked like because we have no records. beyond. And when we go back in time, it's also confusing because the pine pollen, we're trying to find places where there's pine pollen and grass pollen, you know, things that might go together, these wind dispersed species that would be in the pine savannas. It'd be really cool if we could identify Aristida grass pollen, but we can't. All right. We can't identify pine pollen to anything other than, you know, yellow pines or white pines kind of thing. So it's not none of it's a very clear kind of thing. But what we do know is this didn't evolve slowly within the Southeast. It had to have come, the basic components of it had to come. So I haven't given you an answer, but I've answered your question. Yeah, Ruth.
Go back using the word possible.
Yeah.
You find it all the way through the places, maybe in the mice.
Yeah. Yes, there were grassland or open habitat savanna type species here since the Miocene. And we know that the grass pollen increases in the end of the Miocene. So the savannas themselves are appearing in the Miocene along with every place else in the world. This happened all over the world at the same time in the tropics. And we moved from tropical forest or temperate forest to temperate grasslands and tropical grasslands that we think of now as savannas and things like that. And so that is a climate change phenomenon. All right, it is not something unique to any single location. But when we look at the species involved, the species tend to be very different in these different places. It didn't happen in one place and then spread all over the world. It happened contemporaneously in a bunch of different places in the world. So our Aristida is in North America and in South America. And so we have some origin of that, presumably in the Western Hemisphere. And there are a bunch of other species that have these kinds of patterns as best as we can tell. But, and you're right, the animal fossils here might be the best clues that we have, at least of the conditions being conducive for the type of habitat we have now. And obviously, people have done more work with the scrub jays than anything else. And those are not real old immigrants into the Florida. In the places. Yeah, that's another one of those. There are a whole bunch of animals that go along with the plants of being endemic to these kinds of habitats. And it's like, you know, all these bacteria and fungi along with it. I mean, the whole flora and fauna have some sort of origin somewhere in here, if we want to think of it, but it's not where we are now. It's not where the habitats are now. And this is part of what makes me want to insist on tying the old growth integrity not to a site, but to an ecosystem. What we're saying is you can trace some of these things way back if you think about the habitat that they're in and not the particular site. So we know these things are moving all around. I mean, people have done enormous amounts of work on the movement of plants after glaciation up north, but nobody's tried to really do it down here and ask how are these things moving around. We just don't have really good records for that kind of thing, I think. Anyway, anybody else? Yeah.
On the
I'm sorry, I'm going.
on the effects of like how fungus and bacteria is affecting fire interval.
Yeah, I know how the fungi and bacteria are affecting fire now on the wave track. That's the only place I really know because that's the only place we've studied it. But what we do know is that the fires come through and they burn this litter layer and they heat up the soil. And so they change the microbial flora, or flora. They change the microbes. And so what they do is they depress those microbes that are saprophytes, that decay organic material. And they favor kinds of microbes that are specialists on, say, increased nutrients. The concentration of phosphorus in one site that I studied, which is in Louisiana, after fire was 70,000 times that before the fire. When you burn all those stuff off, you're of course volatilizing the nitrogen and the carbon to some extent, but you're not volatilizing phosphorus. It's going into the soil. And all of a sudden, for some microbes, there's this huge resource. So what do? You have these specialists. They're there, and then they're gone. They don't die out. They do some sort of resting stage or something like that, waiting for the next fire, and when all this phosphorus comes back available. In the meantime, after the fire, as new litter winds up on the surface of the soil, here come the saprophytes back. And so you get this kind of pattern of moving back and forth between these. And so it's really a dynamic kind of pattern. And what it does is the decay rate of new litter is about 30 to 50% lower after fire than it is without fire. So what's happening is there are less saprophytes to more of these other kinds of species, and then they're coming back as litter winds up being. So that's the dynamics I can tell you about. And I'm sure there's a lot of other stuff in there. We know that some groups of bacteria, for example, really like hot fires, and they come explode after these hot fires. Maybe they're specializing on char, something that really kind of carbon that gets there. We don't really know all the things about them, but it's really cool because these are really involved and they're really important. And, you know, and people have all these fire models. I mean, there are fire models galore. We have more fire models than who knows what, but none of them include the bacteria and the fungi and their effects and what they're doing. And here they are decomposing this stuff that's going to burn. So it's got to be really important. That's all that. Yeah, I'm sorry, my hearing aids don't pick you up.
State entities or state forests or those.
The workshop was sponsored by the U.S. Forest Service. They are trying to move from these old concepts to current concepts. And they invited scientists. So this workshop was not, the workshop had scientists from the Forest Service, but they are interested, or were, who knows what will happen now, but we can only say this was the goal. When Biden made this pronouncement that they were to work with old growth and we were to conserve old growth. And that was a major directive. And they quickly realized that they had problems with all the old things and how do you deal with all these other ecosystems. So, I mean, you know, I use the Apalachicola National Forest as a prime example of that. And so what the agencies are now trying to do, or were as of the time of the workshop, was to get people to think about these questions involving old growth ecosystems and what we need to use to define old growth. And it quickly came up that where it was important was, as I said, was not conserving museums. We can't treat these as museums. It's no longer feasible. Climate change is going to do the museums in. But what we can do is say, how do these ecosystems that have changed in response to environmental conditions in the past, do they have the properties that will enable them to deal with changes in the future? And the the available evidence we have suggests yes, that those are better able. We have, the geneticists call them evolutionary museums or evolutionary cradles. And you think of these as systems that evolve fast and systems that evolve slow. A system that evolves slow is something like a pitcher plant hog. Those species are there, they're adapted for very specific conditions, and it's hard for them to change, except they can handle things like changes in nutrient levels. What do pitcher plants do when they get a lot of nutrients? They stop making pitchers and they make leaves, we call them phyllodia, and they actually do photosynthesis and function like a real plant. Right? And so these species are actually able to handle pollution, if you think of it from agricultural runoff and stuff like that, better than some of the other plants because they have been exposed to this and dealt with this in their evolutionary past. That's just my easy example for you. So, are the agencies doing it? They're trying to learn how to start. We all are in this together and saying, let's stop thinking about old growth as these museums of the past and think of them as templates for the future. And what we can't think of them as templates in the same way we thought of them as museums. And so the Forest Service, when we do this, we have a book that's coming out. And this book explores throughout the southeastern US all these aspects of old growth systems. And so it's a combination of these are old growth under the old definition, and these are old growth under the new definition. And so we'll see what happens. I place no faith in anything happening for the next 4 years. I mean, I think many of the people that are at the workshop will not have jobs.
I think in the intro, I said it was the Fish and Wildlife Service, but it's both, but it's clearly.
It's the Forest Wildlife, Fish and Wildlife. We had people from the Fish and Wildlife Service, National Park Service, Nature Conservancy, and other organizations involved in the workshop. It was sponsored by the Forest Service, who, because they are the organization which has had to deal with old growth from these national forests and these various places, they took the lead.
Thank you for sharing.
That's that.